I'm Adrienne Mercer, and I'm 50 years old. I grew up above a small engine repair shop in a small town in Ohio, and I rose to become a brigadier general in the United States Air Force. For 30 years, I carried things I could never talk about, and the only thing I ever really wanted in return was for my father to be proud of who I had actually become. But on the morning I reported to my new command, when a young airman waved me off at the gate and refused to believe I belonged, my own father took his side, the way he had quietly taken the side of everyone who underestimated me for 3 decades. Have you ever given everything to someone only to have them treat you as less than you are? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You are not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you are tuning in from. And if you have ever had to quietly stand up for yourself after being underestimated by someone you love, hit that like button and subscribe. My father had ridden in the passenger seat of my car exactly 4 times in 30 years, and the 4th time was the morning he watched a stranger refuse to believe I existed. We were climbing the long grade east of Colorado Springs, the Front Range still blue with shadow, and the radio antennas on the ridgeline were just catching the first light. He had his hands folded in his lap, the way he folds them when he is somewhere he does not understand. I had picked him up from the hotel at 0630 hours, so we would have time to get him a guest pass before my day started. The ceremony was that afternoon. I was taking over as the Deputy Director of Operations at the Command on the Mountain, and I had wanted him there for it, in the front row, more than I had wanted almost anything in years. He looked out the window at the wire and the gray buildings and the flags, and he made the small sound he makes when something does not add up for him. Then he said, "I still don't see why they had to drag you all the way out here to do it." I kept my eyes on the road. I had learned a long time ago that the road was a good place to keep my eyes when my father talked about my work. He was 74 years old, and he had run a small engine repair shop in our town in southern Ohio for longer than I had been alive. And he believed, in a way that had nothing to do with cruelty, that the important things in life happened within about 40 miles of that shop. Everything past that was distance. Distance was suspicious. Distance was where they took your daughter and gave her back to you twice a year, polite and tired, doing something with computers that nobody could explain. The thing he did not know, the thing he had never asked to know, was what I had carried out there in the distance. I had carried things most people will never know exist. I had stood in rooms that do not appear on any map and held objects whose weight I am still not allowed to describe. That morning, the only thing I wanted to carry was my father's pride, and that turned out to be the heaviest thing I had ever picked up. To understand the gate, you have to understand the shop, and to understand the shop, you have to go back to the year my mother died. I was 10 years old in 1986 when we lost her. She had been sick for a long time in the quiet way that small towns let women be sick, at home, with the curtains half drawn, and then she was gone, and my father and I were left in the apartment above the shop with a grief neither of us had any words for. My father has never been a man of words. He is a man of hands. So 3 days after the funeral, when he found me sitting on the back step not crying because I had run out of the ability to cry, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He brought me down into the shop, set a carburetor on the bench in front of me, and showed me how to take it apart. "Hands busy, head quiet," he said. That's the Mercer way. We rebuilt that carburetor together at the workbench, under the one good light, and somewhere in the middle of it, with grease on my fingers and my father's shoulder warm against mine, I stopped feeling like I was going to come apart. That was his love. He could not say he was sorry. He could not say he missed her. He could not say he was frightened of raising a girl alone. But he could teach me to make a broken thing run again, and he could stand close while he did it. And for a long time, that was enough. For a long time, it was more than enough. The shop became the whole world after that. Smelled of gasoline and cut metal and the particular sweetness of 2-stroke oil. And I learned its geography the way other children learn a playground. I knew which drawer held the snap rings and which one held the gaskets. I knew that the 3rd stool from the door wobbled and that you set your coffee on the bench, never the windowsill, because the window leaked when it rained. My father opened at 7 and closed at 6 and ate his lunch standing up. And on Saturdays, I worked the counter while he worked the back, and the men who came in with their dead mowers and seized chainsaws would look at the girl behind the register, and then look again when she diagnosed the problem before they had finished describing it. My father liked that. I could tell he liked it, the way he would press his lips together to keep from grinning when a customer's eyebrows went up. He was proud of me inside the walls of that shop. It was only the world outside the walls that he could not quite let me have. I was a strange kid for that town. I read the repair manuals cover to cover, not because I had to, but because I wanted to know why each part did what it did. I fixed the neighbors' mowers before I could drive. I tested at the top of my class without trying very hard, and the teachers would call my father in and tell him I should think about somewhere big, somewhere far, and he would nod politely and drive home and not mention it. He had a plan for me, and the plan was the shop. Mercer and daughter. He had already imagined the sign. So when I was 18, in the summer of 1994, and I sat him down at the kitchen table above the shop and told him I had enlisted in the Air Force, he treated it first as a joke, and then, when he saw my face, as a phase. "The Air Force," he said, turning his coffee cup a slow quarter turn on the table. "So you'll be, what? Fixing radios out there? Long as it's steady work, I suppose. Long as they treat you right." I told him I did not know yet what I would be doing. That was true. What I did not tell him was that I had scored high enough on every test they gave me that the recruiter had stopped talking like a recruiter and started talking like a man who had found something. I did not tell him because I could already see that the more impressive it was, the smaller he would need to make it, just to keep it close enough to hold. I left in the fall. He shook my hand at the bus, did not hug me, and told me to call when I got where I was going. I called. I always called. For 30 years I called, and for 30 years he found a way, gently, without ever once meaning to wound me, to set my life back down to a size he could carry. I remember the morning I left more clearly than almost anything from that part of my life. It was September, and the air had that first cold edge to it, and my father stood on the cracked concrete in front of the shop in his work clothes because he had not thought to change. And when the bus pulled up, he handed me a paper sack with 2 sandwiches in it and a roll of quarters for the payphone. He had counted out $10 in quarters, so I would never have an excuse not to call. I have thought about that roll of quarters many times in the years since. It was the most tender thing he knew how to do, and it was also, in its way, a leash. $10 of insurance against the distance he was already afraid of. He stood there and watched the bus until I could not see him anymore. I know because I watched him too, through the back window, a smaller and smaller figure in front of a smaller and smaller shop, until the road curved and he was gone. The base came up over the rise, and my father folded his hands tighter, and I drove us toward the gate, where a young man was about to teach me that some things you carry your whole life can still surprise you with their weight. The dismissals were never loud. That is the thing I have tried to explain to the few people I have ever explained it to. My father never yelled, never forbade, never told me I had failed. He did something quieter and more durable. He shrank me one sentence at a time, across decades, until the shrinking was just the shape of how he talked about me. It started early. In 1996, I was a senior airman, 20 years old, working in an intelligence shop on a base I will not name, and I was good at it in a way that got noticed fast. I could see how scattered pieces fit, how a dozen unrelated reports were actually one story told by people who did not know they were telling it. There was a chief master sergeant there named Lonnie Decker, a barrel-chested man with 30 years in and eyes that did not miss much. And one afternoon, he stood behind my desk for a long time watching me work, and then he said something I have never forgotten. "You see the whole board, Mercer," he said. "People who see the whole board don't stay in the corner of it. You're going to commission. I'll make sure of it." He did make sure of it. He rode me toward officer training school, the way my father rode me toward the carburetor, with a kind of gruff insistence that did not leave room for argument. And in 1999, at 23, I was commissioned a second lieutenant. I called my father from a payphone outside the parade field, with the new bars still bright on my shoulders and my hands actually shaking from how much I wanted him to be proud. "An officer," he said. There was a pause on the line, and in the pause I could hear him deciding how to hold it. "Well, that's good. That's real good. Just don't let them work you to death over a desk somewhere, all right? Don't forget to eat." That was the call. That was the shape of every call. The accomplishment and the diminishment, arriving in the same breath, so close together that you could not separate them without seeming ungrateful. There was a woman in my OTS class named Renata Cho, sharp and dry and impossible to fool, and she became the friend who picked up the phone for the next 27 years. She heard 100 versions of that call over the years. She was the one who taught me to name it. "He's not putting you down," she told me once. "He's pulling you back in. It's the only rope he's got." She was right, but knowing why a thing hurts does not stop it from hurting. Chief Master Sergeant Decker retired the year after I commissioned, but he kept track of me from a distance the way good mentors do. He would send me a short letter when I made a new grade, 2 or 3 lines in a blocky hand, always ending the same way. "Keep seeing the whole board." When I made major, he sent me a challenge coin he had carried for 20 years. When I told him, much later, and in the vaguest possible terms, that I had been selected for an assignment near the center of things, he wrote back one line. He wrote, "I always knew you'd end up in a room I'm not cleared for, and I have never been prouder of anything." I keep that letter in a drawer. I have thought more than once about the difference between a man who was proud of me for going far and a man who was afraid of me for the same reason, and how I happened to have one of each, and how the one who was not my blood found it so much easier to simply be glad. The years stacked up: first lieutenant in 2001, captain in 2003, and my first deployment to the Middle East that same year, the work getting quieter and more serious with every assignment, the rooms getting smaller and the clearances getting higher. By 2010, I was a major, and I had been selected for an assignment that I could describe to my father in exactly 7 words. I would be working in Washington for a while. What I actually did in Washington between 2011 and 2014 was serve as a senior Air Force aide to the President of the United States. I was one of the officers who carries the satchel. People call it the football. I will not describe it beyond what is already public, which is that it is never more than a few steps from the president, and that the people who carry it are vetted to a standard called Yankee white, and that very few human beings on Earth hold it. I held it. I stood that close to the center of everything for 3 years, and I could not tell my father a single true sentence about it. On a rare visit home in 2014, just after that assignment ended, my father introduced me to a customer who had come in to pick up a tilled engine. He put his hand on my shoulder, proud in his careful way, and said, "This is my daughter. She does something with computers for the government." I smiled and shook the man's hand. I had spent 3 years standing 10 feet from the most powerful office on Earth, and to my father, I had a desk and a government login. I did not correct him. I never corrected him. I told myself it did not matter, that the work was the reward, that I did not need a man in a repair shop in Ohio to understand the architecture of national command to know my own worth. In 2025, when I called to tell him I had been selected for Brigadier General, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Proud of you, kiddo. Real proud." And then, before I could even feel it land, he said, "Does this mean you can come home a little more now, or does it mean less?" The compliment and the wound, the same breath, the same rope. I had stopped expecting anything else from him by then. That is the part I am least proud of. Somewhere around my 40th birthday, I had quietly closed the account, decided that my father was simply a man who could not see past the county line, and resolved to stop being hurt by a thing I could not change. It did not work. You cannot decide to stop wanting your father to be proud of the actual shape of your life. You can only decide to stop admitting that you want it. So I stopped admitting it to him and to myself, and I poured everything into the work, where the seeing was clear and the judgments were fair, and a person was exactly as good as her last decision under pressure. The military had its faults, more than I could count, but it had never once introduced me to a stranger as a girl who did something with computers. It saw me. For a long time, I let that be enough, the way the shop had once been enough, and I told myself that a daughter who is seen correctly by an entire institution does not get to complain that she is seen wrong by one stubborn man in Ohio. So when we pulled up to the visitor control point that morning, and my father looked at the security fencing and said he did not see why they needed me all the way out here, I felt the old pattern sitting in the car with us, alive and well on the morning that was supposed to be mine. I did not know yet that within 5 minutes a stranger would say out loud, with no idea who he was talking to, the exact thing my father had been saying gently for 30 years. The visitor control point at Peterson sits just off the main approach, a lane and a booth, and a low building where guests get processed, and at 0650 hours on a weekday, it was not busy. There was one airman working the lane. He was young, very young, the kind of young that has not yet been surprised by anything, and he had the bored, certain posture of someone who has decided that the most interesting thing that will happen today already happened yesterday. I pulled up and put my window down. He did not look up from his clipboard right away. When he did, he took in the rental car and my civilian clothes and my father in the passenger seat, and I watched him make a decision about all of us in about half a second. "Turn around, ma'am," he said. "This is a restricted installation. Visitor center can't help walk-ups today." "I'm reporting for duty this morning," I said. "I need a guest pass for my father. He's attending a ceremony this afternoon." The airman, whose name tape read Lang, gave me a small, tired smile, the kind you give someone you have already filed away. "Right. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to back out of the lane. You can call the visitor center and make an appointment." In the passenger seat, my father shifted. I knew what was coming before he said it, because I had heard it my whole life, and still, when it came, it went in like a splinter. "I told you we shouldn't have just shown up, Adrian," he said, low, embarrassed, already apologizing to the young man with his tone. "These people are busy. We should have called ahead." That was the betrayal, not the boy at the gate. The boy at the gate did not know me, owed me nothing, was guilty of nothing worse than a bad assumption on a slow morning. The betrayal was the man beside me, my own father. On the one day I had asked him to come and be proud, taking the side of the stranger who was waving me off, choosing the gatekeeper over his own daughter the way he had been choosing the smaller story over the true one for 30 years. I did not look at him. I held out my credentials to the airman. He glanced at the card in my hand and waved it away without taking it. He actually waved it off, a little flick of his fingers, the way you wave off a flyer someone is trying to hand you on a sidewalk. "I don't need to scan that," he said. "Just go ahead and back out before you stack up my lane." "Airman," I said. My voice did not rise. In 30 years, it had learned not to need to. "Scan the card. There is a register a person can use that is not loud and is not threatening and yet leaves no room at all, and it is not a thing you can fake. You earn it in command, in the rooms where decisions cannot wait and there is no second chance, and the people around you need to move now and ask questions never." I had not planned to use it on a 22-year-old at a visitor gate. I would have much preferred to keep driving the morning the way I had planned it. A quiet pass for my father, a quiet walk into my new job. But he had waved off my credentials twice, and a credential is not a courtesy, it is the law of the installation. And the law of the installation does not bend for a young man's bad morning. So I gave him the register, just once, 2 words, and I watched it reach him. Something in how I said it reached him finally, under the boredom. He rolled his eyes, the smallest insolent roll, and he took the card, and he turned to the reader in the booth and swiped it. I watched his face. That is the part I remember most clearly. I watched the screen throw its light up onto him, and I watched him read what it said, and I watched him read it again, because the first time his brain refused to accept it. The scanner had flashed 2 lines. The first line was my name and my rank. The second line, the one that does not appear for almost anyone who has ever driven through that gate, read Yankee White, and beside it, Priority 1. The color went out of his face from the top down, like water draining from a glass. His hand, the one holding my card, started to shake. He set the card down very carefully on the ledge, as though it had become something fragile, and he stepped back from the window, and he came to attention so fast and so hard that his heels cracked together. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice had gone thin. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Stand by, ma'am. Please stand by." He finally saw the thing the machine saw, and so did the man sitting next to me. I turned, then, and looked at my father. Walter Mercer was staring at me as if a stranger had been driving his daughter's car all along and he was only now noticing. His mouth was slightly open. His folded hands had come unfolded. For the first time in my life, I watched my father look at me and not know what he was looking at. And the strange, sad truth of it was that this was closer to the truth than any look he had given me in 30 years. Behind us, the short line of cars had gone quiet. The airman was reaching for the radio on his shoulder, and when he keyed it, his voice cracked on the first word. The flight chief came at a run. His name was Hector Salas, a master sergeant, 41 years old, and he covered the distance from the building to the lane faster than I would have thought a man his size could move. He took one look at the screen in the booth, one look at the young airman standing rigid and pale, and one look at me, and he sorted the entire situation in about 3 seconds. There is a specific competence that senior enlisted carry, an ability to absorb a disaster and begin fixing it in the same instant, and Salas had it. "General Mercer," he said, and he came to attention himself, but a controlled one, a working one. "Ma'am, my apologies. I'll escort you onto the installation personally. Airman Lang, hold your post. Report to me at end of shift." "Master Sergeant," I said, "there's no emergency here. I need a guest pass processed for my father, and then I need to get to the headquarters building." "Yes, ma'am, we'll have it done in 2 minutes." He was already moving, already directing the young airman through the process with a quiet, clipped patience that told me he intended to make this a teaching moment rather than an execution. I respected that. It told me what kind of flight chief he was. While Salas worked, my father tried to talk. He kept starting sentences and abandoning them. "Adrian, Then nothing. That boy, he didn't. Then nothing. What did that screen? Then nothing. The size of what he had just watched was too large for the words he had been using for 30 years, and he could not find any others, because he had never needed any others. He had spent 3 decades making me small, precisely so that he would never have to find words this big. There is a thing that happens in the body when you have spent a career absorbing other people's assumptions, and it happened to me there in the lane while Salas worked. My pulse did not change. My breathing did not change. 30 years of being underestimated had built a kind of stillness in me that no longer required any effort to maintain. I could have been waved off by 100 airmen and felt nothing but a mild, distant patience. The stillness was not for the airman. It was never going to crack for the airman. It cracked, very quietly, for the man in the passenger seat, who had just done the one thing I had asked him not to do on the one day I had asked him to do the opposite, and who was now staring at me as though the floor of his understanding had given way. We got the pass. Salas escorted us through, walking beside the car to the headquarters building, and at the curb, he came to attention one more time and apologized again. And I told him, again, that there was nothing to apologize for, that the airman had done nothing I would not survive, and that I wanted to talk to him later about how the young man was handled. He understood me. I could see that he understood me. He had the look of a senior non-commissioned officer who had just watched a general decline to make a meal of a junior troop's worst mistake, and who was recalibrating, in real time, what kind of officer he was now working for. "I have learned that you teach people who you are in the first hour, whether you mean to or not, and that the lessons taught by mercy last longer than the lessons taught by fear." I parked. My father sat in the passenger seat and did not move to get out. I needed a minute too, so I let us sit there, the engine ticking as it cooled, the headquarters of the command rising in front of us, gray and unremarkable, and holding in sight it some of the most consequential work done anywhere on the continent. I called Renata. She picked up on the second ring, because she always picks up, and I told her what had happened at the gate in about 6 sentences, flat, the way I report things. She was quiet for a moment, and then she did what she has done for 27 years, which is cut straight to the bone. "So the kid at the gate didn't know," she said. "That's fixable in an afternoon, and it sounds like you're already fixing it the right way. The question I'd be sitting with if I were you is the other one." She paused. "Does your dad know now? Because that's the gate that's actually been closed." I did not answer her right away. I looked over at my father, who was looking at the building, and I felt the whole weight of it settle. I had spent my entire career being completely unbothered by people who underestimated me. Strangers, peers, senior officers, foreign officials, all of them. I let their assumptions slide off me like rain off a wing. I had never once in 30 years managed to be unbothered by him. After I hung up, my father finally spoke, and his voice was so quiet I almost missed it. "What does that mean?" he asked. "On the screen. Yankee white. What is that?" And I realized, sitting there in the parking lot, that he had never asked me a real question about my work in my entire adult life. Not one. He had never asked because asking would have meant admitting there was something there big enough to need asking about. He had kept me small by keeping himself incurious, and the incuriosity had felt, to both of us, like a kind of peace. "It's a clearance, Dad," I said. "It means I was trusted with something very few people are trusted with. For a long time." He nodded slowly, the way he nods at an engine he cannot diagnose. And for the first time I let myself wonder what it would take to make him actually see me, and whether I even still wanted to try. We sat in that parking lot longer than we needed to. The sun had come up fully over the plains behind us, and the gray buildings had gone from blue to white, and people in uniform were walking from their cars to the doors with their coffees and their badges, the ordinary morning traffic of an extraordinary place. My father watched them. He watched a young captain hold the door for a colonel, watched the colonel nod, watched the small choreography of rank that governs every hallway I have walked for 30 years, and I could see him trying to fit me into it, trying to understand where in that choreography his daughter stood. He had no framework for it. To him, a boss was a boss and an employee was an employee, and that was the end of the organizational chart. The idea that I was the kind of person for whom an entire room would come to its feet was not a fact he lacked. It was a category he did not possess. I was about to give him one. I made 2 decisions that day, deliberately, and I made them in the order that mattered. The first was about the Airman. When I finally got inside and up to the operations floor, my new boss was waiting for me. Major General Sam Pruitt, the director of operations, 55 years old, a tall, easy man with a handshake like a vice, and a reputation for being exactly as smart as he needed to be, and no more performative about it than that. He had already heard. Of course he had heard. Word of a brigadier general getting waved off at her own gate travels across a command at the speed of delight. "Adrian," he said, shaking my hand. "Welcome to the mountain. I'm told you almost didn't make it onto your own installation this morning." He was trying not to smile, and mostly failing. For what it's worth, that young defender just had the worst and most educational morning of his career. He waved off the most cleared officer on this mountain. "Say the word, and I'll have him counseled into next year." "I'd rather you didn't," I said. He raised an eyebrow. "He followed an instinct instead of a procedure," I said. "That's a training problem, not a character problem. I want him mentored, not ended. Have Master Sergeant Salas walk him through every line of gate protocol, make sure he understands exactly who he nearly turned away and why it matters, and then in about a month, I want the airman himself to brief me on it. Not Salas. Him." Pruitt studied me for a second, and then he nodded, and something in the nod told me I had passed a test I had not known I was taking. "That's a better answer than the one I offered," he said. "Consider it done." I have spent my whole career watching how people use power the moment they get it, and I have learned that the cheapest thing in the world is to make an example of someone who cannot fight back. The young man at the gate had humiliated himself far more thoroughly than I ever could, and grinding him down would not have made me larger. It would only have made me the kind of officer who needed him to be small. I had spent enough of my life on the receiving end of that arrangement to know I would never run it from the other side. The second decision was about my father, and it was much harder because it had been 30 years in the knot-making. That evening, I drove back to the hotel where he was staying, and I sat down across from him in the small room with the bad lamp and the bedspread the color of nothing. And I did the thing I had never done. I told him I was not going to let the line slide anymore. "Dad," I said, "for 30 years you've told people I do something with computers for the government. You said it to that customer in the shop. You've said it at church. You said the spirit of it again in the car this morning, right before a 22-year-old waved your daughter off her own base. I have let you say it my whole career, because correcting you felt like vanity, and because I didn't want to embarrass you. I'm not going to let you say it anymore." He got defensive first, the way people do. "I never said anything bad about you. I always told people I was proud." "You did," I said. "You were proud of a version of me that fit in your shop. I'm telling you that version isn't real, and the real one is standing in front of you, and she's tired of being made small by the one person whose opinion she actually wanted." He was quiet for a long time. And then my father, who has never in his life said a complicated thing about a feeling, said the truest thing I have ever heard him say. "If I'd said out loud what you really did," he said slowly, looking at his hands, "I'd have had to admit how far away it was, and how little of it I understood, and how much of your life happened in rooms I'll never get to stand in." He swallowed. It was easier to make it small. Small I could hold. Big I'd have had to let go of. "You could have just asked me," I said after a while. "Any year, any of the 30. You could have said, 'Tell me what you really do out there,' and I would have told you everything I was allowed to. I was always waiting for you to ask." "I know," he said. "I was afraid of the answer. I thought if I really understood how far you'd gone, I'd never get you back." "You never lost me," I said. "I called every week for 30 years, Dad. I'm the one who never stopped calling. You're the one who kept the conversation small enough to fit on the phone." He had no answer for that because there was none. We sat with it. There it was. The rope, finally named by the man who had been holding it. The diminishment had never been contempt. It had been fear. He had been so afraid of losing me to the distance that he had spent 30 years shrinking the distance down to a size that would fit on a workbench, and the thing he had shrunk every time was me. We sat there in the bad light with the real conversation finally on the table between us, and neither of us knew how to pick it up. The ceremony was that afternoon, in a hall on the base with the command seal on the wall and rows of folding chairs and the particular hush that military ceremony imposes on a room. My father sat in the front row in the suit he wears to funerals and weddings, the only suit he owns, his hands folded in his lap. I stood up front in my service dress, the single star bright on each shoulder, and I took on the responsibility of Deputy Director of Operations of a command that watches the skies over an entire continent. Major General Pruitt spoke. A senior leader from the command spoke. And in the middle of his remarks, the senior leader referenced, carefully and within the limits of what could be said in an open room, the years I had spent in service to the National Command Authority, the assignment in Washington, the trust that had been placed in me at the highest level. I was watching my father when that part came. I saw it land on him. I saw him understand, for the first time, sitting in a folding chair in a hall on a mountain in Colorado, that his daughter had stood inside the most guarded rooms in the country. He had seen me rebuild a carburetor when I was 10. He had never once in 40 years seen me at work. And now he was seeing the shape of it, the size of it, the thing he had spent 3 decades refusing to look at directly because looking at it meant admitting how far I had gone. His hand came up to his face. He is not a man who cries, and he did not cry, exactly. But he pressed his fingers against his mouth and held them there, and his eyes were bright, and he did not take his eyes off me for the rest of the ceremony. I want to be precise about what that moment cost him, because it would be easy to make it sound like a clean and happy thing, and it was not clean. To accept that I had stood inside those rooms, my father had to give up a story he had told himself for 30 years, the story in which his daughter had wandered off into a vague government distance and was probably, mostly, fine. That story had protected him. It had let him not worry, because you cannot lose sleep over a clerk, and it had let him not feel left behind because a clerk does not go anywhere you could not follow. Sitting in that folding chair, he had to trade that comfortable story for a true one, and the true one was harder to hold. The true one said that his daughter had gone somewhere he could never go, had carried weight he would never feel, had been trusted by people he would only ever see on television, and had done all of it without him, while he turned carburetors in a shop in Ohio and told the neighbors she did something with computers. That is a hard thing to take on at 74. I watched him take it on. I watched it reorganize his face. Meanwhile, 2 buildings away, a young airman was beginning the harder work. Salas, true to my instruction, had put Senior Airman Lang through every line of gate protocol that afternoon. Slowly, the way you teach something you intend to stick. He had explained who the woman in the rental car had been, and what the second line on the scanner meant, and why a defender at a gate does not get to decide who belongs based on civilian clothes and a tired morning. I heard later what the young man said when Salas finished. I decided who she was before I scanned the card, Lang said. I'm never doing that again. That is what accountability sounds like when it is allowed to teach instead of just punish. He had not been broken. He had been corrected, and the correction had taken, because it was aimed at the behavior and not at the boy. After the ceremony, in the thinning crowd, my father came up to me where I stood in my uniform. He still could not find words. He reached out, and with the careful, precise hands that had rebuilt 1,000 engines, he straightened one of the ribbons on my chest that had gone a little crooked, squaring it the way he used to square a part on the workbench. He did not say he was sorry. He has never said he was sorry, but he squared that ribbon and he held my eyes while he did it. And it was the closest thing to an apology a man like my father knows how to give. I let him fix the small thing he could reach, because I understood finally that fixing small things had always been how he loved me, and that the problem had never been the fixing. The problem had been that he had spent 30 years insisting I was a small thing, so that I would stay in reach of his hands. Forgiveness, the real kind, is not a single moment. I did not forgive my father in that hall, with the ribbon squared and his eyes bright. What happened in that hall was that we both stopped pretending. Forgiveness came later, in pieces, the way he was always going to have to take down the wall he had spent 3 decades building, one sentence at a time. The next morning, we sat in the coffee shop on the base, and my father did the second unprecedented thing in 2 days. He asked me about my work. "Tell me about it," he said. "The parts you're allowed to. I won't understand most of it, but I want you to tell me anyway." So I told him the unclassified shape of it. I told him what a command center does, in general terms, and what it means to watch a continent's airspace. And I told him, because it was already public and I had carried it for 3 years in silence, what it had meant to be one of the officers who stays near the president, and what the satchel is, and how close I had stood to the center of everything. He listened with his whole body, leaning forward, his coffee going cold. When I finished, he was quiet, and then he said, "You stood that close, and you never told me." "You never asked, Dad," I said. "For 30 years you never asked." We both did that. I stopped offering because you kept making it small, and you kept making it small because I stopped offering. We built that wall together. He nodded. He could not argue with it because it was true. I set the new terms, gently but without leaving him an exit. "I'm not asking you to understand all of it," I said. "Most of it I can't even explain. I'm asking you to stop telling people it's nothing. You don't have to follow what I do. You just have to stop telling the world your daughter does something with computers like I'm a clerk you're vaguely fond of." "I can do that," he said, and then, with a flicker of the old stubbornness that told me he was still himself, might take me a while to get the words right. "General, Deputy Director of..." It's a mouthful. "Take your time," I said. "I've got the rest of my life." He turned his coffee cup a slow quarter turn on the table, the exact gesture from the kitchen above the shop 30 years before, when an 18-year-old had told him she had enlisted and he had decided to treat it as a phase. I do not think he knew he was doing it. The body remembers what the mind forgets. But I saw the gesture, and I understood that we were sitting in the same conversation we had started in 1994. That it had simply taken 3 decades and a scanner at a gate to reach the part where he actually heard me. Some conversations are like that. They go underground for years and you think they are finished, and then one morning they surface again, and you discover they were running the whole time just out of sight, waiting for the ground to be ready. I called Renata that night and told her about the coffee shop, and she laughed her dry laugh, and then she gave me the warning I needed to hear. "Don't you dare expect him to turn into a different man by Thursday," she said. "He spent 30 years building that wall one sentence at a time. The only honest way for him to take it down is the same way, one sentence at a time. You let him do that. You don't get to be impatient about it just because you finally got the apology you've been waiting for since 1994. She was right. She is annoyingly often right. I have thought a great deal about what Renata said, about taking the wall down one sentence at a time. There is a temptation, when someone who has wronged you finally admits it, to want the whole debt paid at once, to want them transformed overnight into the person they should have been all along. I felt that temptation. After my father named his fear in that hotel room, part of me wanted him to come out the other side of the conversation, completely changed, fluent in my life, easy with my rank, the father I had wanted at 23 when I called from the payphone with the new bars on my shoulders. But that is not how a person changes, and it is certainly not how my father changes. He is a man who rebuilds engines, and he knows better than anyone that you cannot reassemble something faster than its tolerances allow. You torque each bolt to spec in sequence, or the whole thing fails under load. He was going to have to rebuild 30 years of how he spoke about me one bolt at a time, in sequence, and my job was not to rush him. My job was to let the repair hold. A month later, Senior Airman Travis Lang stood in front of my desk, at attention, and briefed me on gate access protocol, every line of it, clean and complete and professional. He did not flinch. He did not grovel. He had done the work, and he knew it, and when he finished I told him so, and I signed off on him without any ceremony, because the best thing I could do for a young man who had learned his lesson was treat him like someone who had learned it. He left my office standing a little taller than he had come in, and I understood that I had done more good keeping him than I ever would have done breaking him. The institution and the family, it turned out, repair by the same rule. Earn it back, slowly, in the open, one sentence at a time. No scanner flashes the moment trust comes back. There is no light on a screen for that. You just keep showing up correct, day after day, until one day the gate that almost turned you away runs the way it always should have. The summer turned into the work, the way it always does. I settled into the operations role on the mountain, deep in the tempo of a command that does not sleep, good at the job, carrying weight I still cannot describe to anyone outside a very small circle. Major General Pruitt turned out to be exactly the kind of boss I had hoped for. A man who handed you a hard problem and the authority to solve it and then got out of the way, and who measured you by whether the problem got solved and not by how loudly you announced your involvement. We did good work together that summer. I cannot tell you what most of it was. I can tell you that there were nights I drove down off the mountain at 0200 hours with my eyes burning and my mind still 3 time zones away. And that the work mattered, the way the work has always mattered, in ways that do not photograph and do not make the news and are felt only as the absence of the disasters they prevent. The work did not change. What changed was the thing I carried home in my chest at the end of the day, and the phone calls that waited for me there. My father called more. That was the first sign. He had never been a caller, and now he called, awkward and trying, asking real questions about my day within the limits I had given him. He would ask what the weather did to the mountain, whether I had eaten, whether the altitude still bothered me. Small questions, but real ones, and underneath each one was the thing he was actually asking, which was, "Are you still letting me in, now that you have learned you do not have to?" In late summer, he slipped. He was introducing me to a neighbor over the phone, holding the receiver out so the man could say hello, and out of 30 years of habit, he started to say, "This is my daughter. She does government work." I heard him start it. And then I heard him stop, in the middle of the sentence, and correct himself out loud in front of the neighbor with a kind of effortful dignity that undid me a little. "No," he said. "That's not right. She's a general. Brigadier General Adrian Mercer. I should say it right." He got it wrong, and then he caught it, and the catch mattered more than the slip ever could. A man does not unlearn 30 years in a season, but he can learn to catch himself, and the catching is the whole proof that something has actually changed. The neighbor, I learned later, had asked him a follow-up question. The neighbor had said, "A general, what does she do?" And my father, who 6 months earlier would have shrugged and changed the subject, had apparently squared his shoulders and said, "She works at the command on the mountain in Colorado, the one that watches the skies. And before that, she worked in Washington, close to the top, closer than I'm allowed to say." He got the details a little wrong. He always will. But he had stood in his own kitchen and reached for the largest version of me he could hold instead of the smallest, and he had done it without me in the room, when there was no one to perform for and nothing to gain. That is the part that undid me when I heard it. The diminishment had always happened when I was not there to defend myself. Now the opposite was happening in the same empty rooms. The pattern had not just stopped, it had reversed. I took stock of it one night, alone, looking out at the dark shoulder of the mountain. I had spent a career being seen correctly by strangers, and incorrectly by the one person whose seeing I actually wanted. Generals saluted me. Foreign officers deferred to me. A president had trusted me with the gravest things a person can be trusted with. And my own father had introduced me as a clerk for 30 years. That equation had finally, slowly, begun to balance, and the strangest part was that I did not entirely know what to do with the lightness of it. I had carried the weight of his diminishment so long that its absence felt almost like falling. What does it feel like, I kept asking myself, after 30 years of being made small at home, to finally be allowed to take up your full size in the one place that had never permitted it? I did not have the answer yet, but for the first time in my adult life, I had the question, and the question was not a wound. It was an open door. In the autumn, my father flew out to Colorado Springs to visit, on his own, and this time he knew where he was going. He came through the same visitor control point. A different shift, a smooth process, and the airman who waved him through with a crisp and correct greeting was Senior Airman Travis Lang, squared away now, exactly the defender he was supposed to be. The gate that had nearly turned me away ran the way it should, and the young man who had waved me off welcomed my father onto the base like the professional he had become. I do not think my father ever knew it was the same airman. I knew, I noticed, and I let myself enjoy the symmetry of it, the small, clean closing of a circle. We had dinner that night, just the two of us, at a quiet place with a view of the Front Range going gold. And my father, unprompted, told me he had been reading. He had gone to the library in our town, the same library that had once told him I should go somewhere far. And he had checked out books about the Air Force, about the command on the mountain, about the things he thought I might do. I missed a lot of it, he said. Most of it, probably. I'm trying to catch up. You don't have to catch up, Dad, I said. You just have to be here. That's all I ever wanted. Not for you to understand the architecture of national defense. Just for you to stop pretending I wasn't part of it. He nodded, and then he reached into the bag he had brought and set something on the table between us. It was a small thing, a little brass mechanism, polished bright, and it took me a second to recognize it. It was the first thing I had ever rebuilt on my own. At 12, a tiny model engine I had assembled from a kit and a box of salvaged parts. He had kept it on a shelf in the shop for almost 40 years. He had cleaned it up and brought it across the country to give back to me. You were always going to be bigger than the shop, he said, not quite looking at me. I knew it when you were 10. I just didn't want it to be true because true meant far. I'm sorry it took me this long to say so. I picked up the little brass engine and turned it over in my hands. The fittings were clean. He had gone through it before he packed it, I could tell, had taken it apart and cleaned each piece and put it back together, because that is the only way my father knows how to say a thing matters to him. He does not write cards. He does not make speeches. He cleans the bearings on a 40-year-old toy and carries it 2,000 miles to set it on a table in front of his daughter. I have received commendations from people whose names you would recognize. I have been handed medals in rooms with the flag behind me and cameras off. None of it landed the way that small, clean engine landed, sitting in my palm in the gold autumn light, because none of it had ever come from him. He said he was sorry. After everything, after 30 years, my father said the word, and he said it over a small brass engine that was his entire language for love, finally pointed in the right direction. I have thought about the gate a great deal since then, about the young airman and the wave of his fingers, and the scanner throwing its light up onto his face. And I have come to understand that the reveal at that gate was never really for him. He was just the machine's mouthpiece. The scanner said out loud in 2 cold lines of text the exact thing my father had spent 30 years refusing to say. It said, "This person is more than she appears." It said, "You do not get to decide she is small." And once a machine had set it in front of him, in a place where it could not be softened or shrunk or set back down to fit on a workbench, my father could not unknow it. The truth got inside the wall, and the wall came down. So if there's someone in your life who has spent years making you small, I want to tell you something I learned in a rental car in a parking lot on a mountain, with my father staring at me like he had never seen me before. You do not always need them to understand everything you are. You may never get that. The architecture of your life may be too far from theirs for them to ever really stand inside it. But you do have the right to ask them to stop pretending you are nothing. You have the right to insist on your own size. And sometimes, if you are very lucky, they will sit in the front row when it counts, and they will straighten a crooked ribbon on your chest with their careful hands, and they will finally say it right. That is not revenge. I never wanted revenge. What I wanted, it turned out, was much simpler and much harder. I wanted to be seen by the man who taught me to make broken things run again. And in the end, on a mountain a long way from a small engine repair shop in Ohio, I was. That is the kind of peace no scanner can flash on a screen for you. No machine will ever light up and tell the people you love who you really are. You have to insist on it yourself, calmly, without raising your voice, for as long as it takes. And then you have to give them the time to take down, one sentence at a time, a wall they spent a lifetime building. My father and I sat on the porch of my place that last evening of his visit in the thin gold Colorado light, and we did not talk much. We did not need to. He had brought a small carburetor with him in his bag, a stubborn one off a neighbor's tiller that he had not been able to coax back to life. And after a while, he took it out and set it on the table between us, half a joke and half a peace offering, and the two of us bent over it in the fading light the way we had bent over the first one the year my mother died. Hands busy, head quiet, the Mercer way. I had carried the gravest objects a person can carry, and I had stood at the center of the country's most guarded rooms, and none of it was better than this. A broken thing on a table, and my father's shoulder warm against mine, and 40 years finally pointed in the same direction. For the first time in 30 years, we were on the same side of the gate. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. If you have ever had someone in your family decide who you were before they ever really looked at you, I would love to hear about it. Was there a moment the truth finally came out for you? Did the person who underestimated you ever come around, or are you still waiting? And if you had been in my place at that gate, would you have pushed for that young airman to be punished? Or would you have let him learn? Tell me in the comments. I read them. And if this story meant something to you, take a second to subscribe before you go.